Okay, everybody. This is Pete, and I'm going to be providing my technology resource review presentation on dyslexia. I wanted to narrate my slides to be more inclusive towards dyslexic learners and, leverage technology to help them out and, kind of put my money where my mouth is, so to speak. I'm trying to talk a little slower than usual. I can be a bit of a fast talker. So if anybody who does struggle with dyslexia can give me any critique that would help me, I'd really appreciate it. So what I'm going to cover are some of the basics, like what is dyslexia, why does it matter, can technology help dyslexic students, helpful technologies and strategies, further challenges, conclusions I've drawn and that the author, Jessica Hannam, has drawn, my opinion, and some questions to consider. So, first, what is dyslexia? Dyslexia is a learning disability that inhibits the ability of the learner to develop phonetic connections between word sounds and words themselves. This often leads to significantly slowed and inaccurate reading and is considered a decoding issue by most contemporary researchers and physicians. When we talk about decoding, when we look at letters, they signify sounds, and we kind of take for granted how our brain processes looking at an abstract shape or symbol and associating it with a sound. So, this is something that dyslexic learners kind of struggle with. And what's pretty amazing is that dyslexia impacts between 5 and 15% of Americans today, with the difficulty of diagnosis being a significant reason for the disparity in estimations. So, between 5 and 15% of all Americans are dyslexic, and so many go undiagnosed, which is a huge problem with this learning disability. And we're going to talk more about that. So, why does it matter? I mean, obviously, if you're dyslexic, you would say it matters in my everyday life. But the reason why I chose to review Jessica Hammond's article, Accommodating Students with Dyslexia, is because I'd previously explored the marginalized group and I developed an interest. I do not suffer from dyslexia, but I found it really interesting. The sheer scope of dyslexic learners in the United States, from 5 to 17% per Hammond, and 5 to 15% per Yale, um, means that it could impact as many as or more than 50 million Americans every year. So its commonality makes finding solutions extremely necessary. Can technology help dyslexic students? And the simple answer is overwhelmingly yes. The development of new technologies has made intervention in dyslexic learning much more feasible, and when paired with specialized education plans, can lead to more positive outcomes than ever before. And to quote Yale University, um, assistive technology helps dyslexics save time and overcome challenges such as slow note taking and poor handwriting, allowing them to demonstrate their abilities in ways that were once unimaginable. So, one of the first interventions that Jessica Hammond discusses is the use of audiobooks. And audiobooks are an obvious remedy to the coding issues of dyslexia as they bridge the phonetic coding gap. So, being able to hear the words as you're reading them, as you're processing and decoding the symbols into sounds, is extremely useful for somebody who struggles with that. Another thing is that audiobooks and e-readers, they offer other solutions that can inhibit dyslexic learners. The e-readers and online textbooks offer the ability to modify the backlighting of the text, whereas a regular book cannot, making the brightness of a page modifiable for a reader who may need to look at pages for longer durations. And what that means is that if it takes you longer to read something because you are struggling with a learning disability, looking at a bright screen or even a sheet of paper for a long period of time can hurt your eyes, give you headaches, things like that. So being able to adjust the brightness of the page becomes even more important to somebody who's struggling with dyslexia. You can also take away the stigma of ear reading by offering audiobooks as a reading option for the whole class. And this is a really good way to be inclusive in a classroom, is just tell everybody to use their audiobooks. As a non-dyslexic learner, I prefer listening to a text while I'm reading it. It kind of covers two bases for me. So this is a really good point to increase inclusivity and reduce stigma of dyslexic learning. So the allowing the students to use note-taking apps is another really thoughtful intervention. Note-taking can be difficult for students with dyslexia, especially transcription of lectures and spoken directions. So there are apps out there like Evernote or Notability, and they allow students to take pictures of notes and review them later. Instructors can also provide their own outlines for students that they can review on their own time as well. So for instance, if you're, outlining for your lectures as an instructor, providing those outlines via Canvas or Google Classroom so that students can read them at a slower pace if they need to, especially students who struggle with reading, can be a really thoughtful and helpful way to leverage technology to help dyslexic learners. Permitting students to record assignments, instructions, and lectures for playback is also a really great intervention that Jessica Hammond brought up. At the root of dyslexia is a language processing issue, so students with dyslexia sometimes struggle with multi-step verbal instructions and paying attention through long lectures. And that makes sense because if they're getting lost trying to read and write while listening to lectures, you could run into issues with multi-step verbal instructions. So letting a student record lectures and assignment instructions using Siri through Apple, or Read and Write, which is an extension of Text Help through Google Chrome, are really good ways to allow students to process this information. And alternatively, teachers can record their own lectures and provide them to the entire class. And this would be a great way to increase inclusivity because you're basically giving it to every student in the classroom and not just focusing or centering in on a student who struggles with dyslexia. So encouraging the use of text-to-speech is another really helpful tool in the toolbox of dyslexic students. As students progress, especially into high school, they will be expected to read significantly above their academic ability, a challenge especially for dyslexic students. And this just comes into play when you think about some of the reading you're doing at the higher end of high school. You might be reading Greek literature. You may be reading some primary sources from ancient times, for instance, in a social studies setting. And this can be difficult for non-dyslexic students. So when you add in dyslexia, it becomes very challenging. So text-to-speech can be a real game changer for completing class assignments for dyslexics, per Jessica Hammond. The great way to figure out if something offers this technology, especially websites, is the Browse Aloud logo, and it provides students with a clear indication of text-to-speech enabled websites. And you could also use Read and Write via Text Help via Google Chrome, which was already brought up, and it's very helpful. So with these technological interventions, which are all really helpful, there are still challenges to providing interventions for dyslexic students. And two of the biggest are the diagnosis rate and the stigma associated with dyslexia. Regarding the diagnosis rate, despite affecting so many people in America, dyslexia goes heavily undiagnosed. Dyslexia occurs on a spectrum, so some students may fly under the radar with a mild case while others are profoundly impacted. And that's a really big point. When we think about spectrum disorders in general, whether it's things like autism, which are very popular right now, um, or dyslexia, sometimes some children who seem less affected or have developed coping mechanisms to work around them don't get the help that they need. Dyslexia can occur comorbidly, which means at the same time as or in conjunction with other learning disorders like ADHD, dyscalculia, which is the mixing up of numbers, the hard difficulty of decoding numbers, or dysgraphia, which is a writing disorder where children will sometimes write things backwards. They may also have trouble writing in straight lines, things of that nature. Parents may consider ocular problems as being the cause of dyslexia before concluding it is learning disability. So, children who say, "Hey, I'm having trouble reading and it hurts my head," because they have to read something for so long, or they struggle with the font size of a book, parents may assume that they're having trouble reading because of an eyesight issue, and they may go that route before looking into neurological issues like dyslexia. And stigma plays a really big part in challenging interventions in dyslexia. Students with dyslexia are often embarrassed of their difficulty with reading and writing. And when you compound that with teachers maybe asking kids to read aloud in class for the classroom, it can be really, really difficult for a child to not feel embarrassed. Children may just avoid reading and writing altogether to protect themselves from feeling inadequate. And I think we can all understand why that would be the case. Another issue is that some parents, they may be unwilling to have their children diagnosed or assigned an IEP or 504 to help with dyslexia because they're afraid that they'll be labeled as a special education student. They're afraid of the stigma of being a parent of a child with special needs. And they're just afraid of the long-term impact it could have on their child. It's important to note when considering the stigma that dyslexia has no connection with intelligence or IQ, but those affected by the learning disorder often score poorly in intelligence and IQ examinations, leading to the false assumption that the two concerns are inherently linked. So because they struggle with the reading because of dyslexia, they score poorly on IQ and intelligence exams, making it seem like they're low IQ or unintelligent, when that is absolutely not the case. So at the conclusion of Jessica Hammond's Accommodating Students with Dyslexia, it provides some extremely easy ways to combat dyslexia in the classroom with readily accessible modern technology. She provides easy interventions that most students have access to. However, she could also better point out how teachers can take the reins and leverage technological advances as opposed to putting the onus on students. And I think that this was something important for me. Children are children. They should be supported by instructors and technology. And I think it's up to instructors to really learn how to leverage technology and teach students how to do it, as opposed to kind of just giving them options and expecting them to figure it out. And finally, an opinion that I have here. In my opinion, Hammond's best arguments are those in which technology is used in both the general and special education setting to bridge the gap between both types of learners and effectively kill the stigma of dyslexia. By providing an inclusive dyslexic standard for education for all, a teacher can advocate for better technological interventions as well as advocating for more inclusive classrooms. So instead of setting up, like a separate way of teaching students with dyslexia, you can kind of teach all students as if they're dyslexic by providing these types of interventions just across the board and create a more inclusive classroom. Instead of, just kind of doing this in a reactionary sense, just waiting for a student with dyslexia who needs help and then providing these types of aid, you can just provide them proactively right out of the gate to all students. And this way it's just a inclusive environment for dyslexic and non-dyslexic learners. And based on how few children are diagnosed with dyslexia, you may catch and help a lot of students who didn't even know they needed it in the process. And finally, a few questions that I have for the class. And I've had a lot of fun just with these discussions with the class in general. So you guys have all been awesome. But with this information in mind, what is one way in which teachers can leverage technology to create classrooms more inclusive for dyslexic students? Secondly, what points would you provide for a parent who's concerned with how a dyslexia diagnosis could impact their child? And finally, what is an easy way to leverage technology to help dyslexic learners that you plan on using in your classroom after graduating from Rutgers? Here I just have a list of authors cited and any further reading or learning anybody would like to do regarding dyslexia. And the article was Jessica Hammond's Accommodating Students with Dyslexia Through Edutopia. And once again, everybody, thank you so much for listening. I hope that this helped. And I look forward to hearing and reading some of your slides as well.